The iron door of the cage rattled against the stone, a deafening sound in the silence of the black woods. "You will serve your king, girl, or you will serve the soil," the warrior snarled, his breath smelling of stale blood and old ambition. My legs were too bruised to run, my spirit too wild to break. I raised my chin, ignoring the silver cuffs digging into my wrists, and faced the colossal shadow of Arkenmoor's most feared ruler. "I will never be your bride," I yelled at the Alpha King, the words echoing, not just in the forest, but in the cold, haunted chambers of his immortal heart. Alexander Morgan, all 27 years of her defiant spirit, smelled of wood smoke, rosemary, and an unyielding, dangerous independence. That particular Thursday had started like any other in Crooked Hollow, the fringe down clinging precariously to the edge of the vast, terrifying Arkenmoor kingdom. The air was thick with the scent of pine and impending doom, a fragrance Alexander had learned to live with ever since she was old enough to stir the communal stew pot. She was the best cook in town, her soup a legend of comfort in a land short on it, and her mother, Alara, a woman whose eyes held 1,000 untold secrets, kept their small shack humming with a quiet, anxious energy. They were paupers, yes, but they were free. That freedom, however, was as fragile as old glass. Alexander stood over the iron cauldron, the steam rising to fog the one small, cracked window, when the ground began to tremble, not with the earth's natural rhythm, but with the terrifying, synchronized thud of 1,000 booted feet. The sound wasn't of men marching, it was of war arriving.
"Lexa, inside, now!" Ilara's voice, usually a soothing balm, was a razor edge of terror. Alexander didn't need telling twice. She grabbed the cast-iron ladle, the only weapon of defense she possessed, and flung the door wide open, only to be met by a wall of black armor. The King's Royal Guard, the Obsidian Wolves, had arrived. They wore no insignia, only the absolute, chilling authority of Adam Eden, the Alpha King. His presence was so powerful it was said his warriors carried a piece of his dread with them. The lead warrior, a mountain of muscle named Kale, stopped directly in front of their shack, his eyes sweeping over the dilapidated structure with cold contempt. "We seek the cursed bride," he announced, his voice booming over the sudden silence of the paralyzed town. A collective gasp swept through Crooked Hollow. The cursed bride, the prophecy. Everyone knew the tale, an ancient, whispered fear. The Alpha King will take a reluctant queen, and through her rebellion, peace shall be born, or blood will drown the kingdom. For years it had been just a spooky bedtime story, a way to keep children in line. Now it was a death sentence delivered on the king's own terms. "We have no brides here, only cooks and cleaners," Alexander said, stepping out in front of her mother. Her hands, dusted with flour and grime, were locked into fists. She tried to project an aura of boredom, but inside, a beast of pure, cold panic was trying to claw its way out.
Kale's gaze settled on her. It wasn't a look of recognition, but one of brutal, clinical appraisal. He was looking at a possession, a necessary evil, a tool to fulfill a cryptic text. "She is slender, defiant, and reeks of sulfur and defiance," Kale muttered, reading from a small, brittle scroll. His eyes flickered back to Alexander's sharp, challenging gaze. "Take her. She is the one." Alexander didn't wait for them to grab her. She swung the heavy iron ladle not at Kale, but at the lamp hanging precariously in the doorway. The glass shattered, plunging the immediate area into smoke and darkness, giving her a precious second to flee. She bolted, not towards the forest, which would have been predictable, but into the narrow alleyway leading to the communal well, weaving through frightened neighbors like a desperate shadow. She was fast, honed by years of fetching water and outrunning stray dogs. But the wolves were faster, trained to hunt the most elusive prey. They tackled her just as she reached the well's cold stone edge. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. The ladle clattered uselessly away. Rough, iron-smelling hands dragged her up, pinning her arms behind her back with a strength that felt less like human muscle and more like granite. "I will not go with you," she shouted, twisting and kicking. "The prophecy doesn't ask for permission, girl," Kale steered, shoving her towards a dark, open cage mounted on a massive armored cart pulled by two black beasts that looked more like saber-toothed lions than horses. "You're making a mistake! I'm nobody! I'm the janitor's daughter!" Alexander screamed, struggling against the ropes they were now tying around her wrists. Her eyes met her mother's across the distance. Ilara stood utterly still, her face a mask of profound sorrow and utter defeat. But in her eyes, Alexander saw a fleeting, almost undetectable flicker, not of fear, but of an old, devastating recognition. And then Alexander was shoved into the cage, the iron door clanging shut like the final nail in her coffin. The journey to Arkenmore Castle was a blur of darkness, bone-jarring jolts, and the oppressive silence of a kingdom that knew better than to question its king. The castle was not a building. It was a scar on the mountain, carved out of obsidian and granite, looming under the perpetually bruised sky of the high peaks. Torches blazed in the courtyards, their flames sputtering against the incessant wind, casting gargantuan shadows that danced and twisted like ancient hungry spirits. Alexander was dragged from the cage, her legs weak, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But her spirit, miraculously, still alight. They led her deep within the stone labyrinth, down halls where the air grew cold enough to freeze blood, and finally into the throne room. It was a cavern of power. Black basalt walls rose to an impossible height, the ceiling lost in the shadows. The floor was polished obsidian, reflecting the orange-red torchlight like a pool of fresh blood. And at the center of it all, upon a throne that looked like a jagged tooth ripped from the mountain itself, sat Adam Eden, the Alpha King. He was massive, even seated. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his arms corded with muscle that strained the thick, dark tunic he wore. At 37, every harsh line on his face, every scar, every tribal rune inked across his exposed skin spoke of a life spent in brutal, unending command. He was half naked, literally wearing his power, his aura so palpable it pressed against Alexander's skin, stealing her breath. His eyes, fixed on her, were indeed the cold, mesmerizing color of polished obsidian. He did not move, yet the air around him crackled with contained, lethal energy. The guards shoved Alexander to her knees. Her bruised legs screamed in protest, but her gaze never left the king's face. She didn't tremble. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Adam tilted his head slightly, a movement that was more like a predator adjusting its sight than a man. The silence was absolute, a crushing, thunderous void punctuated only by the distant howl of the mountain wind. "I will never be your bride!" The scream ripped from her, raw and uncontrolled, shattering the oppressive quiet. It was born of fear, rage, and a desperate, defiant refusal to become a footnote in some dusty old text. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The guards flinched. Kale, who stood nearest, actually recoiled, a gasp escaping his lips. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to the Alpha King in such a way. It was a violation of law, of nature, of common sense. Adam, however, remained still. His expression didn't change for a long, agonizing moment. Then he slowly, deliberately began to rise. His sheer size, fully unveiled, was shocking. He dwarfed the throne, filling the space with his presence. Power coiled in every vein, radiating from him like heat from a furnace. He descended the 3 stone steps that separated him from her, moving with a deliberate, smooth grace that belied his bulk. He stopped a foot away, his shadow engulfing her. "You think I want you?" he said, his voice deep, a rumble of thunder trapped in the mountain, but with a surprising hint of amused menace. I could have had queens from 7 realms, daughters of other alphas, women bred for submission and carrying my lineage. But prophecy demands you, the cursed cook with fire in her eyes. He paused, his gaze burning into hers. You spat on my kingdom by defying the decree. You disrespect centuries of tradition. Alexander knew she should beg, or at least pretend to cower. But the injustice of it all fueled her. The realization that her life, her person, was nothing more than a pawn for a selfish king and a superstitious text was infuriating. With a superhuman effort born of pure, unadulterated fury, she spat, a small, wet sound, directly onto the polished obsidian floor at his boots. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt as though the very air had been sucked from the room. The guards looked ready to execute her on the spot. And that's when Adam Eden laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was rough, unused, and echoed off the stone like a fallen god's amusement, a deep, rich baritone that held no warmth, only power and surprise. He threw his head back, and the sound filled the chamber, silencing the terrified gasps of the onlookers. He looked down at her, a strange flickering light in his obsidian eyes. You just made this interesting, Alexander Morgan. He extended a massive scarred hand and cupped her chin, forcing her to look up. His touch was surprisingly gentle, yet firm, radiating heat. He dropped his hand, and the heat vanished. I am not interested in a compliant wife, Adam stated, his voice now cold, all amusement gone. I am interested in a catalyst. You will stay, you will rebel, you will survive. And if the prophecy is true, your survival will determine the fate of my kingdom. Now, remove her. And Kale? Kale snapped to attention. If a single hair on her head is harmed by anyone in this castle, you will face the shift without mercy. The guards roughly pulled Alexander to her feet and hauled her away. As she was dragged out, she twisted her head back for one last, defiant look. Adam Eden was already back on his throne, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep. He looked less like a king and more like a statue of immense power, already planning the next terrifying move in a game she hadn't agreed to play. As she was led through the endless, echoing halls, a chilling thought settled in her mind. Adam Eden hadn't been angry. He had been intrigued. She hadn't earned his wrath. She had earned his attention. And in Arkenmore, the Alpha King's attention was perhaps the most dangerous curse of all. The gilded cage of the East Wing awaited her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had survived the first confrontation. The rebellion had begun the moment she screamed, and she would not stop until she was free, or until the king was dethroned. The choice, it seemed, was hers to make, one way or another. The East Wing was less a set of chambers and more a declaration of gilded war. Alexander was escorted through a maze of stone halls until they reached a secluded wing overlooking the sheer drop of the mountain's western face. Her royal protection was a luxurious prison, a suite larger than her entire home, with tapestries woven with images of howling wolves, a massive stone hearth, and a bed piled high with furs and silk. Yet the tall windows were fitted with unbreakable crystalline glass, and a pair of silent, massive guards stood sentinel outside the heavy carved oak door. She hated it instantly. It smelled of ancient power and suppression. The first thing Alexander did was refuse the dinner brought by a trembling servant girl. The second thing she did was kick the velvet stool until it splintered. The third thing was demanding to see the kitchen. I am a cook, she informed the guard, a stoic warrior named Barros, who looked perpetually carved from granite. A cook needs to cook. If the king intends to keep me alive as his catalyst, he'd better allow me to maintain my skills, or I'll waste away from sheer boredom. Barros, caught between the king's explicit order to keep her contained and the king's equally explicit order not to harm a single hair on her head, looked deeply troubled. "The king's steward will bring your meals, Lady Alexander." "Lady," Alexander scoffed, wiping the soot from her knuckles. "I'm Alexander Morgan. I smell like wood smoke, not lavender. I don't eat food I didn't prepare. It's an insult to my profession. Tell the steward if I don't get a kitchen, I will fast until the king himself has to listen to my stomach growl." Her defiance, so unexpected from a prisoner, was surprisingly effective. The next morning, a pale, harried steward arrived, apologizing profusely, and explaining that a small, secondary kitchen was available in a disused corner of the East Wing's lower floor. It was a compromise Adam clearly sanctioned. He wanted her contained, but he was also indulging her rebellion, a disturbing sign of his calculated patience. The moment Alexander stepped into the secondary kitchen, the heavy air of the castle lifted slightly. This was her element. The space was dusty but functional, with a massive stone oven, copper pots hanging unused, and a large worn wooden counter that felt reassuringly familiar under her fingertips. She immediately set about cleaning, scrubbing away years of neglect, the rhythmic action of the brush a balm to her frayed nerves. Days turned into a week, then 2. Alexander refused to wear the gowns the servants delivered. She stayed in her simple homespun clothes, tied her hair back with a piece of rough twine, and devoted herself to making the best peasant food Arkenmore had ever tasted. She cooked for herself, then she cooked enough for her guards, sharing bowls of rich, savory stew with Barros and the others. She never asked them questions about the king. She simply offered comfort. The guards, hardened warriors who rarely smiled, found themselves waiting for her kitchen hours. She was irreverent, sharp-witted, and refused to acknowledge their royal status, treating them instead like particularly large, hungry cousins. She teased Barros mercilessly about his poor potato-peeling technique. The rigid atmosphere of the East Wing began to thaw, replaced by the faint, comforting aroma of baked bread and simmering herbs. Meanwhile, Alexandra studied the castle's rhythm. She mapped the guards' shifts, the delivery routes, the weak points in the routine. She was a cook, but she was also a prisoner planning her escape. She knew the king was watching, but she also knew he wasn't omnipresent. Her main concern was why her mother, Alara, hadn't tried to contact her. Crooked Hollow wasn't that far. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. One evening, deep in the night, Alexander was kneading dough, unable to sleep, when she felt a shift in the temperature of the room, a subtle, primal awareness that prickled the fine hairs on her neck. She didn't look up, didn't stop her hands' rhythmic work. She simply waited. A shadow detached itself from the doorway. He hadn't used the main door. He hadn't made a sound. He simply was there. "Stealing potatoes, your royal arrogance?" Alexandra asked, not turning, her voice steady. Adam Eden stepped fully into the light cast by the hearth. He wasn't in his formal tunic. He wore only dark breeches, leaving his immense torso exposed. The runes on his skin seemed to pulse in the firelight, and the sheer physicality of him was breathtaking, overwhelming. He moved like a silent force of nature. "They informed me you refuse to eat the royal provisions. Only your own." "Royal provisions are bland and designed for weak stomachs," she retorted, finally looking up. Her eyes met his, obsidian to brown, and the tension was so immediate, so thick it felt like an actual physical barrier between them. "I like my food and my life spiced up." Adam's lips curved into the slightest of smiles, a rare and dangerous sight that softened the edges of his face but not the coldness in his eyes. "You're feeding my gods better than the royal cook."
"They are hungry men," Alexander shrugged, tossing the dough onto the counter with a loud thwack. "And I am a good cook. They treat me like a person. I treat them to a decent meal. I find that respect is a mutual transaction, King, something you might know little about." He didn't take offense. Instead, he walked slowly toward the counter, his gaze sweeping over the clean surfaces, the organized spice jars, the simple, honest beauty of her workspace. "The prophecy mentions rebellion," Adam said, leaning against the counter, his proximity making Alexander's heart thump a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was dangerously close to him, smelling the deep, earthy scent of him, pine, stone, and a raw, metallic undertone of dominance. "I expected shouting, demanding freedoms, perhaps assassination attempts. I did not expect revolution by beef stew." "Oh, the rebellion is coming," Alexander assured him, picking up a heavy, curved knife and chopping vegetables with focused, furious precision. The blade flashed inches from his hand, which was resting near the cutting board. Adam watched her, utterly fascinated. He had faced armies, betrayals, and dark magic, but never a woman who treated him like a slightly annoying visitor in her kitchen. "You are not afraid of me," he stated, less a question than a realization. "I am terrified," Alexander admitted, slowing her chopping. Her gaze was unflinching. "But fear is a terrible flavor in soup, and it's a worse foundation for a life. I will not live in fear of you, or your prophecy, or your ridiculous title. You took me, you confined me, but you will not break me. You want a reluctant queen? Fine. But you will get a cook who burns down the castle if you overcook the lamb." His laughter, that low, rich rumble, echoed in the small kitchen again. It disarmed her, confused her. It was a sound that made the monster seem almost human, which was far more terrifying than the monster itself. "I expected shouting, demanding freedoms, perhaps assassination attempts. I did not expect revolution by beef stew." "Oh, the rebellion is coming," Alexander said, turning back to the pot. She noticed the small, almost imperceptible way he flinched when she mentioned the word cook. She filed the observation away. It was a potential weakness.
He stayed for another hour, silent, watching her work, occasionally picking up an ingredient and subjecting it to his intense scrutiny. He didn't speak of the prophecy or the pending wedding. He simply was. His presence made the air thick and electric, and Alexander found herself struggling not to rush, not to tremble. It was a strange, silent test of wills. She refused to acknowledge his power. He refused to leave. Finally, he spoke, his voice serious again. "Your mother, Alara, she is safe. She was returned to Crooked Hollow with a generous stipend." Alexander stopped stirring. Her heart leapt. "You didn't harm her?" "No," Adam confirmed. "Why would I? She is irrelevant to the prophecy. You are the catalyst." "She is not irrelevant," Alexander countered fiercely. "She is my mother. Did she send a message? Did she try to come for me?" Adam hesitated, his obsidian eyes dark and unreadable. "No. She made no attempt to follow you, Alexander. She accepted the terms." That hurt more than any chain. She swallowed the pain, the betrayal, and the confusion. Her mother was a fighter, a fiercely protective woman. Why the silence? Why the immediate acceptance of the stipend? The flicker of recognition she'd seen in her mother's eyes on the day of her capture suddenly returned. Adam seemed to sense her distress, though he couldn't possibly understand its depth. He simply nodded and turned towards the shadows. "Good night, cook." "Good night, royal arrogance," she replied, a little too quickly, a little too forcefully. He paused at the threshold. "If you try to escape, I will not send KL. I will come for you myself." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, raw and primal. As the king vanished into the darkness as silently as he had come, Alexander finally allowed herself to lean against the counter, shaking. She looked down at her hands, still smelling of yeast and spices.
The man was a monster, a captor. Yet he had sought her out not for dominance, but for conversation, for a shared moment of strange tension. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now laced with a dangerous thread of curiosity. She was the cook, he was the wolf. But in the quiet hours of the night, in the smoky kitchen, the line between captor and captive was starting to blur. She realized Adam Eden wasn't just observing her, he was studying her, trying to figure out if she was a threat to be managed or a weapon to be claimed. And she, in turn, was doing the very same to him. Alexander's presence in the East Wing became less of an imprisonment and more of an occupation. Her defiance was so consistent, so utterly unroyal, that it subtly began to infect the atmosphere of the castle. The guards were loyal, yes, but they were also men who appreciated a solid meal and a fearless woman who didn't look at them with terror. Alexander started teaching them basic culinary arts, how to properly sharpen a knife, how to make stock from bones, how to tell when bread dough was perfectly proofed. It was her quiet, domestic revolution. Adam, meanwhile, became a ghost in her kitchen. He would appear 2 or 3 nights a week, always after midnight, always silent, and always without warning. He never ordered her to do anything. He simply watched. Alexander started leaving out small bowls of fresh, sliced fruit or a glass of water, a silent acknowledgement of his bizarre visits. One night, he was more talkative, or perhaps more burdened. He didn't look at her. He stared into the dying embers of the hearth fire, his massive silhouette casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "The kingdom is built on stability," he murmured, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "My father, his father, they used fear as the mortar. It worked. The borders are secure, the people obey. But the life, it is barren. It has been barren for a long time." Alexander scraped the burnt edges off a loaf of bread she was preparing for the morning. "Fear is not stability, king. It's delayed collapse. And you rule over a tomb, not a kingdom. The people obey because the alternative is death. They don't trust you." He turned his head slowly, and his obsidian eyes found hers. "And what do you know of ruling, cook?" "I know that if you feed a man fear, he will eventually eat you," she countered, wiping her hands on her rough apron. "If you feed him trust, loyalty, and a decent bowl of stew, he will follow you into battle. You have everything but the trust, Adam. Why is that?" He stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing the air to ripple. "My reign was born of bloodshed, of a necessary, brutal cleansing of weakness and treachery. Trust is a luxury I cannot afford." "Then you're a coward," Alexander said, the word hanging sharp and dangerous between them. Adam stiffened, his jaw clenching. Alexander braced herself for the rage she knew she deserved, but it didn't come. Instead, he walked to the window, his back to her. "I am haunted by dreams I never had before you arrived. Dreams of fire, of a woman laughing, not mocking, but truly joyful laughter. And blood, always blood." He spoke with a vulnerability that sent a chill down her spine. The impenetrable king was having nightmares? Alexander felt a strange tug of empathy, quickly suppressed. She poured him a cup of herbal tea she had brewed. "Perhaps you need a better mattress," she suggested dryly, pushing the mug across the counter. "Or maybe you're finally realizing that your path of bloodshed has a cost beyond the battlefield." He looked at the tea, then at her. He didn't drink it. He simply nodded and left, disappearing back into the darkness. But the conversation had shifted something fundamental. She had seen a flicker of the man beneath the Alpha King, and that was a dangerous intimacy. The next morning, the palace shifted its attention. A servant girl named Lysa, one of the kitchen assistants Alexander had started teaching to make proper pastry, was found crying in the laundry room. Alexander found her and immediately pulled her into the relative safety of her East Wing kitchen. "What is it, Lysa?" "The king." "No, Lady Alexander," Lysa sniffled. "It's the beta, Lazarus."
Alexander hadn't paid much attention to the king's second-in-command. Lazarus was sleek, ambitious, and radiated an oily, self-satisfied entitlement that Alexander instinctively distrusted. He was the complete opposite of the rough-hewn Adam. "What did Lazarus do?" Alexander demanded. He has been asking questions about you," Lysa whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "About your mother, about the prophecy. He said the prophecy is wrong. He said the king is too weakened by his dreams, and that the true alpha should rule." "Weakened by dreams?" Alexander frowned. The beta was clearly exploiting the king's recent unusual behavior. Lysa leaned in close, her eyes wide with terror. "And he told me the prophecy is a lie. He said he heard the king admit it to the seer. The king needs you, Lady Alexander, but not for marriage. He needs you for your power." The word hung in the air, heavy and metallic. Alexander felt a sudden cold wash of adrenaline. Power. The real prophecy wasn't about a reluctant bride. It was about power. And Adam knew. He had always known. She looked down at her hands, the hands that made stew and kneaded dough, and felt a strange, dormant electricity hum under her skin. She immediately dismissed Lysa, warning her to speak of this to no one. Alexander's mind raced. If Lazarus knew the truth, or suspected it, he was planning a move. He wouldn't just risk insulting the king by spreading rumors of a lie. He would be laying the groundwork for a coup. Later that afternoon, a lavish, stiffly worded invitation arrived via the royal steward. The annual blood moon ceremony was in 3 days. The ceremony was a traditional, solemn rite to renew the king's strength under the powerful lunar cycle, a spectacle of ancient Arkenmore tradition. This year, it was also where the Alpha King would officially introduce his reluctant cursed bride to the assembled nobility and pack members. Alexander looked at the invitation, then at the heavy knife in her hand. Adam wasn't introducing a future wife. He was placing a target on her back, ensuring the world knew she was the key to Arkenmore's stability. He was also placing her in the most dangerous position possible, surrounded by all his rivals. She went back to the kitchen, her senses heightened. She had to talk to Adam, to confront him, but not in the presence of his court. She had to wait for the quiet of the night, when the ghost returned. Alexander spent the next 2 days preparing not a feast, but a strategy. She continued her routine, smiling, cooking, teaching the guards how to make a proper gravy, all the while watching the movements of Lazarus and his men. The air in the castle was shifting, growing taut, charged with ambition. The king's strange intimacy and Lazarus's calculated betrayal had positioned her right in the middle of a political war.
The night before the blood moon ceremony, Adam didn't come to the kitchen. Alexander waited until 3 a.m., but the shadows remained empty. He was preparing for the ceremony, securing his power, perhaps. Or perhaps, realizing the danger she posed, he was already isolating her. Alexander knew she couldn't wait. The beta was moving. She pulled out a small, hidden satchel from under her mattress, a collection of things she had acquired in the East Wing, a piece of flint, a rough rope braided from old drapes, a small, wickedly sharp paring knife. She slipped out of her chambers using the darkness and the knowledge of the guard shifts she had so meticulously learned. Barros, her favorite guard, was on the watch, his back to her. He didn't even turn his head as she moved past his station, a fact that both warmed and chilled her. Her revolution of stew had worked. She headed not for the outside, but up to the highest library tower where Adam often worked and where she knew the royal archives were kept. She needed to know the full truth of the prophecy before the blood moon rose. Climbing was easier than she expected. The castle was ancient, with countless service corridors and crumbling, unused stairwells. She found the archives, a vast circular room filled with scrolls, ancient texts, and the choking scent of dry parchment. The true, ancient records would be kept here. It took her hours, using a flickering torch stolen from a wall sconce, but finally, deep beneath layers of dust and diplomatic records, she found it. A scroll, bound in obsidian leather, marked with the ancient Arkenmore script. She unrolled it slowly, reading the spidery, faded script by the torchlight. Her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat as the words materialized. The Alpha King will be challenged by the born Alpha hidden among the humans. Born under the twin moons to a single mother, her scent masked by the Earth's own spices, she will claim the crown. She will overthrow the king or save him, ruling as his equal. There was no mention of a reluctant bride, no mention of marriage. It was all about a born Alpha, a female Alpha, and the description, scent masked by the Earth's own spices, pointed directly to the cook, the one who always smelled of rosemary and pine, Alexander Morgan. And the final chilling line, the king knows the truth, but uses the promise of the mate bond to bring her close, lest she become his undoing. The betrayal was colossal, a punch to the gut. Adam Eden hadn't been intrigued by her. He had been controlling her. He hadn't been flirting. He had been containing the greatest threat to his throne. Alexander re-rolled the scroll, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with a terrible, icy realization of her own dormant power and the king's calculated, brutal maneuvering. He had always known. He had used her own identity as a weapon against her. She returned to her East Wing chamber just as the first sliver of dawn painted the mountain peaks. She lay on the silk sheets, wide awake, the truth a searing burn behind her eyes. Tomorrow, the blood moon ceremony, tomorrow the confrontation would no longer be about a forced wedding. It would be about power, betrayal, and the fate of two alphas. She now knew who she was, and more importantly, who Adam truly saw her as, his greatest rival. The rebellion, she thought grimly, was about to escalate far beyond beef stew.
The day of the blood moon ceremony was an oppressive affair. Alexander was forced, finally, to wear the clothes of a royal captive, a stiff, intricately embroidered gown of deep burgundy that felt heavy and suffocating. A team of silent servants transformed her, styling her thick, coiled hair, applying cosmetics that made her look like a stranger. The last accessory was the golden manacles placed around her wrists, ostensibly ceremonial but undeniably restraints. They were linked by a short, glittering chain, a visible sign of her status as the king's prize and his prisoner. When she was led down to the great hall, she walked with a proud, stiff gait, refusing to slump. The great hall was unrecognizable. It was packed with the kingdom's elite, the territorial alphas, the powerful families, and hundreds of pack members, all dressed in black and crimson, their faces alight with a mixture of reverence for the king and ravenous curiosity about his captive. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of expectation and barely suppressed tension. Adam was already on the dais, seated on his obsidian throne. He wore his crown, a menacing circlet of sharpened silver, and a heavy cloak of black fur. He looked every inch the formidable Alpha King, unapproachable, ancient, and lethal. When Alexander was led down to stand beside the throne, the collective gasp of the crowd confirmed she was, indeed, the center of attention. She didn't look at Adam, focusing instead on the crowd. That's when she saw him, Lazarus, the beta, stood directly opposite her, his eyes cold, calculating, and fixed not on the king, but on the small glittering chain linking Alexander's wrists. He didn't look like a loyal second in command. He looked like a predator patiently waiting for the kill. The ceremony began with the ancient chants, rhythmic and low, invoking the spirit of Arkenmore and the power of the shifting moon. Adam rose, his voice booming as he spoke of stability, lineage, and the necessity of the prophecy. He introduced Alexander, using the ancient binding term, the reluctant bride, the catalyst, Alexander of the Hollows. His voice, which usually so steady, held a strange tremor, and his eyes, when they finally met hers, held a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. Was it regret or fear of the moment of truth? As the high priest concluded the final binding chant, the moon, now a massive, swollen orb of bloody crimson, reached its zenith, bathing the entire hall in a terrible red glow, the moment of maximum power. That's when the chaos erupted. Lazarus moved with terrifying speed, a blur of dark clothing. He wasn't alone. Several of his closest guards, who had been strategically placed around the hall, drew their swords. But Lazarus carried a different weapon, a dagger of gleaming pure silver, a metal known to weaken and kill werewolves. "The prophecy is a lie," Lazarus roared, his voice echoing over the terrified screams of the pack members. "The king is corrupted, weakened by human blood, and driven mad by his weakness. The true alpha does not need a hesitant, dirty human cook. The king is not fit to rule." He lunged for the dais. Adam reacted instantly, a primal roar tearing from his throat, shaking the very foundations of the castle. He was shifting, the bones in his massive frame cracking, the wolf essence struggling to manifest. But he was too slow. The initial shock had cost him vital seconds. Lazarus reached the king, who was momentarily distracted by the shifting pain and the need to protect Alexander. The beta plunged the silver dagger deep into Adam's exposed side, right below the ribs. The sound was a sickening, wet crunch. Adam Eden gasped, a sound of absolute agony, and staggered back against the throne, the silver already burning his flesh and crippling his ability to shift fully. He was momentarily paralyzed, clutching the dagger's hilt, dark, viscous blood already staining the deep burgundy of his clothes. "Kill the girl!" Lazarus shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of triumph and madness. "End the curse! The kingdom needs a pure alpha!" Alexander, despite the chains and the blinding terror, didn't run. She looked at the wounded king, the silver burning his flesh, the life draining from his obsidian eyes, and she saw not her captor, but the man who was haunted by dreams and who laughed in her kitchen. She didn't hesitate. Her own primal instincts, the alpha instincts she hadn't known she possessed, took over. There was a large, ancient ceremonial torch standing near the dais, its thick hemp wick soaked in oil. Alexander grabbed the massive torch, the unexpected weight feeling natural in her hands. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she swung the torch not at the beta, but at the enormous velvet drapery hanging directly behind the throne. The heavy, dry material caught fire instantly, erupting in a sudden, blinding sheet of flame. The smoke was immediate and thick, engulfing the dais and creating instant pandemonium. Lazarus and his men were blinded, coughing, and disoriented, unable to locate their target amidst the smoke and flames. Alexander dropped the torch and rushed to Adam. He was slumped against the throne, struggling to remain conscious, the silver's poison already spreading. "We have to move," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She ignored the pain in her chained wrists and grabbed his arm, attempting to pull him. He was like trying to move a fallen statue. "Go," Adam whispered, his voice hoarse, guttural. "The beta will kill you." "I told you, fear is a terrible flavor in soup, and I'm not running from a half-baked beta with mommy issues," she snapped, adrenaline flooding her system. She looked around frantically. There was a faint movement she remembered from her nightly explorations, a hidden panel behind the dais, a secret passage known only to the most ancient royalty. "The catacombs," she hissed, yanking on his arm with every ounce of her strength. "The king's escape route." She found the almost invisible indentation and pressed hard. A stone panel, disguised by centuries of dust, groaned and slid open, revealing a dark, cramped stairwell leading down into the bedrock of the mountain. With a superhuman effort, she dragged the monumental weight of the Alpha King into the darkness. She pushed the panel shut just as Lazarus's men, coughing and swearing, started blindly hacking at the smoking drapes. The clang of their swords against the stone was muffled, but terrifyingly close. They were trapped, but alive. Deep in the suffocating darkness of the catacombs, Alexandra held the wounded Alpha King against her chest. He was trembling violently, his skin hot, the silver agonizingly burning his werewolf essence. His labored breathing was the only sound. As he started to shift again from the pain, his bones cracking, his skin tightening, Alexandra pressed her hand firmly against the jagged hilt of the silver dagger, feeling the burning cold of the metal through his blood-soaked tunic. "I've cooked for beasts all my life," she muttered, her voice trembling but firm, trying to anchor them both to reality. "You're just a bigger one, Adam. You stay with me. You don't get to die in a dusty hole after all that plotting." She stayed with him, pressing on his wound, ignoring the rising dread and the raw, terrifying agony etched on the face of the man who had imprisoned her, the man she now knew was a calculating liar, and the man who, for some inexplicable reason, she was risking her life to save. They were two alphas now, alpha to alpha, and this was their truest, most dangerous beginning. If you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe button.
The catacombs were a suffocating maze of cold stone and absolute darkness, the crypt of Arkenmoor's history. Alexander, relying only on the flickering light of a ceremonial lantern she had grabbed at the last moment, was navigating by pure instinct and the desperate need to keep the Alpha King breathing. The silver dagger was still lodged in Adam's side, radiating a chilling, poisonous heat that suppressed his shifting and burned his life force. Adam was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his great weight crushing her as she half-dragged, half-carried him through the narrow tunnels. His primal scent, normally a commanding, aggressive musk, was now weak, metallic with blood and underlined by a terrifying vulnerability. "The silver, you must remove it," Adam managed to rasp, his voice rough with pain, his obsidian eyes barely slits. "If I remove it now, you'll bleed out, you idiot," Alexander hissed, fears sharpening her voice into a desperate edge. She stopped near a cracked stone sarcophagus, realizing the irony of their situation. "We need to cauterize the wound immediately, or that poison will kill you before Lazarus does." She remembered her mother's old remedies, learned in the dusty backwoods where basic medicine was a blend of folk knowledge and necessity. Alexander ripped a strip of thick fabric from the bottom of her expensive burgundy gown, the dress meant for her display as a bride. The tearing sound was oddly satisfying. She found a broken piece of ancient, rusted iron from a discarded torch stand. She began heating it over the lantern's small flame, willing the metal to glow. "It will hurt," Alexander warned, looking down at the massive man who now lay helpless before her, his life utterly in her hands. "I have survived worse," he scoffed, but the tremor running through his body betrayed his fear of the silver's slow, agonizing power. "I doubt that," she muttered. "This isn't a battlefield wound, King. This is betrayal." Alexander quickly braced herself, ignoring the nausea swirling in her stomach. She seized the hilt of the dagger, gripping the burning, cold silver. In one swift, brutal motion, she yanked the dagger free. Adam's roar of pain was primal, a sound that shook the dust from the ceilings. Quickly cut off as he clamped his jaws shut, fighting the need to fully shift and succumb to the agony. Blood immediately began to pump from the deep wound. Without giving him a moment to breathe,
Alexandra pressed the now glowing, searing iron piece directly onto the wound. The smell was horrific. Burnt flesh, silver poison, and raw, feral agony. Adam convulsed, his body arching violently, but he made no sound, his discipline terrifyingly absolute. When the bleeding finally slowed and the wound was charred and sealed, Alexander collapsed back against the cold stone wall, sweating and shaking, her knuckles white. Adam slowly opened his eyes. The obsidian was clear now, the fever receding slightly. He looked at the cook, the born alpha who had just saved his life with the brutal precision of a seasoned warrior.
"You knew," Adam whispered, the accusation heavy and raw. "You read the archives. You know the truth." "Yes," Alexander confirmed, her voice devoid of emotion. "You are a liar, Adam, a manipulator. You didn't bring me here for love or peace. You brought me here to contain the true alpha threat, to cage me with a pretty lie." "I used the marriage as a cloak," Adam admitted, his voice regaining a fraction of its strength. "But I never intended to weaken you, Alexander. I intended to guide you. If I had revealed the true prophecy, Lazarus would have mobilized years ago. He would have killed you before you even understood the power you possessed." He coughed, the movement causing a sharp spike of pain. "I tried to keep you close, to protect you from those who would use your power against Arkenmore." "By loving me?" Alexander threw his own words back at him, the irony bitter on her tongue. "You said you needed to love me so I wouldn't see myself as a weapon. You wanted to neuter my power." "Perhaps," Adam conceded, the honesty stark in his eyes. "But in the watching, in the kitchen, I discovered that my intentions changed. I discovered the laughter you gave me in my dreams was real. And when I saw Lazarus move to kill you, I saw more than the loss of a necessary queen. I saw the loss of my heart's true equal." Alexander stared at him, unable to deny the intensity in his gaze or the raw truth etched on his pain-filled face. She was tired of the game, tired of the lies. "You are an alpha," she said, finally giving voice to her realization, feeling the dormant power rise within her. "And I am an alpha. We are not king and captive. We are rivals who just saved each other's lives." Adam slowly reached out, his hand trembling, and brushed a lock of hair from her sweat-streaked forehead. "An enemy alpha would have left me to bleed. An enemy alpha would have taken the dagger and finished the job, seizing the throne while I was helpless." "I don't seize thrones through treachery, Adam. I earn them. Now can you walk? Because Lazarus will realize we're gone soon, and he'll be sending his hounds down here." The king managed a grim single nod. The alliance, born of blood and betrayal, was forged in the dark heart of the mountain. They were united not by love or law, but by a common enemy and a shared, terrifying power. Adam was weakened, but healing with the supernatural speed of a wolf fighting Silver's poison. For the next 2 weeks, Alexander kept him hidden in a rarely used secure chamber deeper within the catacombs, a safe room designed for the king's ancestors during times of siege. She tended his wound, using her knowledge of natural remedies, herbs she was surprisingly able to forage in the castle's protected winter gardens, to accelerate his recovery and fight the lingering silver sickness. The arrangement was one of intense, forced intimacy. They were trapped, alone, and completely reliant on each other. Alexander had to cook in secret, sneaking up to the East Wing kitchen when the guard shifts were lowest, now cooking not for rebellion, but for the survival of the man who had lied to her.
Lazarus, meanwhile, had claimed the throne, using the king's disappearance and the bloody scene in the Great Hall as proof of Adam's demise and the prophecy's failure. He established a reign of terror, immediately purging Adam's loyalists and turning the castle into a dark, volatile place where fear once again reigned supreme. Alexander and Adam spoke little of the coup, focusing instead on survival and the strange electric tension between them. Alexander was seeing the real Adam Eden, raw, wounded, and forced to trust her absolutely. He, in turn, was seeing the true Alexander, not just the defiant cook, but a fiercely protective, strategic alpha who moved with stealth and commanded his respect. One night, as Alexander was changing his bandages, their eyes met, and the casual touch of her hand on his bare, scarred chest felt like a current passing between them. "You should have left me," Adam rasped, gripping her wrist, stopping her movement. "You could have returned, claimed to be the surviving alpha, and rallied my loyalists. You would be queen now." And rule over a kingdom built on treachery and fear? Alexander pulled her hand free, but gently. "No. I want to win a kingdom built on my terms, not yours or Lazarus's. I want to win a kingdom where the cook can speak to the king without fear. Your kingdom is broken, Adam, and if I am to rule it, it will be as an equal, not as a prize or a reluctant queen." "Then you will need an army," Adam said, his eyes narrowed, studying her. "I have an army," Alexander said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "You just haven't met them yet." She revealed her plan, her kitchen revolution. While Lazarus was purging the nobility, Alexander had been cultivating the servants and the guards, the hidden workforce that kept the castle running. They loved her soup, respected her courage, and hated Lazarus's brutal arrogance. Barros, the head guard, was secretly loyal to Adam and already awaiting a sign. "The lowborn are the foundation, Adam," she explained. "They are the ones who know the tunnels, the weaknesses, the schedules. Lazarus is focused on the wealthy alphas. He has forgotten the people who clean his floors and cook his food." Adam listened, genuinely astounded. His entire life had been spent commanding from the top down. Alexander was building a resistance from the bottom up. "A revolution of kitchen staff," Adam murmured, shaking his head. "Only you, Alexander." "Exactly," she confirmed. "They trust me. They have seen me, the janitor's daughter, defying the king. They know I am their champion." He reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw. "And where do I fit into your revolution, Alpha Morgan?" The question hung heavy, loaded with implication. He wasn't asking about the battle. He was asking about the future, about their partnership. Alexander met his gaze, the brown of her eyes fierce. "You will be the symbol, Adam, the legend that returned. But I will be the strategy. You lead the charge, I lead the people. We stand as equals. And if you ever lie to me again, I swear I will finish what Lazarus started." The unspoken tension between them, the realization of their shared power, the respect, and the burning physical attraction that had only intensified in the dark solitude, reached a critical mass. Alexander, leaning over him, felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Adam, wounded and vulnerable, looked up at her not as his queen, but as his savior and his other half. His hand slid around the back of her neck, pulling her down. Their kiss was fierce, desperate, and devastatingly honest. A collision of two alphas finally acknowledging the profound connection the prophecy had hidden and their own defiance had forged. It wasn't gentle. It was a hungry claiming, a confirmation of a bond stronger than any ritual. It was the moment their two rival powers finally merged.
The time for waiting ended with the full healing of the Alpha King's wound. Adam, now fully recovered, but wiser and humbler, was ready to reclaim his throne.
Alexander, now fully awakened to her own innate alpha power, was ready to claim her place beside him. The moment their lips parted, the alliance was sealed, no longer one of necessity, but of chosen, equal partnership. They emerged from the catacombs under the cover of a freezing pre-dawn mist, meeting Barros and a handful of loyal guards in a secluded courtyard. Barros wept openly at the sight of his king, but he reserved his salute for Alexander first, acknowledging her as the true force behind their survival. "The castle is ready, Your Majesty," Barros reported to Adam. "Lazarus and his top council are meeting in the throne room at sunrise to finalize the purge of the last loyalist families. The servants are in position, and the kitchen staff has prepared a diversion." "Good," Alexander said, adjusting the crude dark leather tunic she now wore, an outfit far more fitting than the burgundy gown. She had reclaimed her identity, trading silk for survival. "We don't want a bloodbath, Adam. We want a surgical strike. Lazarus must be taken alive, or we risk fracturing the kingdom beyond repair." Adam nodded, his eyes fixed on Alexander. His trust in her strategy was absolute. "We move through the old servant tunnels leading directly to the throne room floor. Alexander and I lead. You secure the exits." The advance was swift and silent. They moved through the very corridors Alexander had used in her nighttime explorations, the walls now feeling like the veins of her own body. The servant tunnels brought them directly underneath the throne room dais. They ascended into the room as the first rays of the sun pierced the high windows, illuminating the black obsidian of the throne. Lazarus, seated casually on the king's seat, was mid-sentence, outlining the final executions of Adam's supporters. The room was packed with the traitors and Lazarus's new guards. The sudden, synchronized explosion of sound from the main doors was the diversion. The kitchen staff, armed with pots, pans, and the contents of the pantry, had staged a chaotic, loud assault on the main guard stations, distracting the bulk of the castle's forces. In the ensuing noise, Alexander and Adam stepped onto the dais, side by side, emerging like specters from the stone. The sight of Adam Eden very much alive and radiating an immense, controlled fury caused instantaneous terror. Lazarus froze mid-sentence, the blood draining from his face as he stared at the man he had personally assassinated.
Adam didn't speak. His eyes, now burning with the amber light of the fully merged alpha, were fixed on his former beta. Lazarus recovered quickly, reaching for the sword at his hip. "Impossible! You are dead! I killed you with silver!" "You killed a part of me, Beta," Adam growled, his voice low and dangerous. But the other part was protected. Alexander stepped forward, cutting through the Beta's rising hysteria with quiet authority. Her brown eyes now held that same fierce amber glow. "It ends here, Lazarus," she stated, her voice steady and clear. "The true prophecy was never about a reluctant bride. It was about a born alpha rising to challenge a corrupt system. I am that alpha, and I challenge you." Lazarus laughed, a manic, desperate sound. "A cook? A human pauper? You lie! The king is trying to save his skin by creating a diversion. I am Alexander Morgan, daughter of the Hollows. I am the woman who fed your starving guards, cleaned up your messes, and refused to tremble. I am the alpha who saved the king, and I am the queen who will hold this kingdom accountable." Adam reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers, alpha to alpha. The action was a silent, powerful claim of both their bond and their equality.
The sight of the feared king holding the hand of the cook side by side was the final, devastating blow to Lazarus's legitimacy. Adam spoke, his voice ringing with a renewed authority. "Lazarus, you betrayed your king, you abandoned the pack, and you attempted to subvert the will of the Alpha line. You are hereby exiled, stripped of your rank and title." Lazarus, defeated but still defiant, made a last, desperate lunge for Alexander, believing her to be the weaker target. He never made it.
Alexander didn't use a sword. She used the power that had always been hers, masked by the scent of spices. A raw kinetic force erupted from her, hitting the beta with the unseen impact of a wrecking ball. Lazarus was slammed backward against the obsidian wall, hitting the stone with a sickening crack, instantly knocked unconscious. Her power was devastating, precise, and untamed. The entire room fell silent. The traitors dropped their weapons, staring not at the massive king, but at the fiercely powerful woman beside him, the cook, the janitor's daughter. Adam looked at Alexander, a mixture of awe and fierce pride in his eyes. He had known she was powerful, but he hadn't known the extent of her innate, raw alpha strength. Alexander turned to the stunned assembly. "The war is over. The treachery is finished. The king and I will rule Arkenmore, not as two separate powers, but as one equal force. Fear will no longer rule you. Justice and accountability will. Now kneel." And they did. The nobles, the traitors, the remaining guards, they all dropped to their knees before the newly claimed alpha pair. Alexander and Adam stood together on the dais, the rising sun now fully illuminating the throne room. They were alpha to alpha, king and queen, equal partners in power and life. The prophecy was fulfilled, not through a wedding, but through a brutal, beautiful confrontation. The future of Arkenmore had begun, founded on a lie, cemented in blood, and secured by the courage of a cook who refused to be broken. The days following the coup were a whirlwind of change, consolidation, and intense political maneuvering. Adam and Alexander, now ruling officially as co-alphas, a title unprecedented in Arkenmore history, began the grueling work of dismantling the kingdom built on fear and erecting one based on justice. Adam handled the military and political rehabilitation, replacing Lazarus's brutal appointments with loyalists and merit-based leaders. Alexander, the former cook, initiated the social revolution. Her first decree was the abolition of the pauper tax, levied heavily on the fringe villages like Crooked Hollow. Her second was establishing a public judiciary system, removing the king's absolute power to determine punishment. Her third, and perhaps most revolutionary, was creating the Royal Kitchen Corps, a program to train and empower the lowborn with culinary skills, giving them status and a pathway out of poverty, thereby cementing her loyalty among the common folk. She spent her days in the Great Hall, side by side with Adam, debating policy, interviewing officials, and learning the brutal arithmetic of rule. She was sharp, quick, and surprisingly ruthless when necessary, proving that she was far more than a catalyst. She was an indispensable leader. Adam watched her, not with the possessiveness of a king, but with the deep, unwavering respect of a partner who had finally found his perfect, powerful equal. Their relationship, forged in fire and betrayal, was a volatile blend of passion, intellectual rivalry, and absolute trust. The tension that had simmered in the kitchen now burned bright in the chambers. They challenged each other constantly, their arguments often ending in fiercely passionate reconciliation, cementing a bond that transcended the mate claim of werewolf tradition. They were two equal alphas, two independent powers, perfectly balanced. "You've already accomplished more in 2 weeks than I did in 10 years, Adam admitted late one evening, watching her pore over trade documents.
They were alone in the library, the glow of the fire reflecting in his obsidian eyes.
"That's because you were fighting to survive, Adam," Alexander responded, not looking up. "I am fighting to thrive. There is a difference. We must rebuild trust before the next shoe drops. And you know it will." Alexander had not forgotten the strange silence from her mother, Alara. Despite their newfound power, Alexander had sent trusted, discreet messengers to Crooked Hollow. The answer was always the same. Alara was safe, well provided for, and refused all contact, saying only, "The queen has her own path now. I am simply the beginning of her story." The mystery gnawed at Alexander. Her mother's strange behavior, the masked scent, the hidden alpha lineage, it all pointed to a story far deeper than a simple secret. Then, the true crisis began. Messengers arrived, breathless from the northern borders. It wasn't human rebellion or rival werewolf clans. "My king, my queen," the messenger panted, collapsing before them. "The borders of the Shadow Vale, they are failing. The Etherians are stirring." The word Etherians plunged the room into a cold silence. These were the creatures of pure shadow and magic, creatures of myth that haunted the edges of the mortal world, entities that preyed on the weakening of the Alpha line. They were the reason Arkenmore was founded, to keep the Shadow Vale closed. Adam gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "They are only legend, Alexander. They haven't been seen in centuries." "Legends are just history written with too much fear, Adam," Alexander countered, her gaze fixed on the map. "They prey on instability. And we have just had the biggest power vacuum this kingdom has seen in generations. Lazarus may have been the distraction, but this is the real war the prophecy warned us about." The ancient text had warned. Peace shall be born, or blood will drown the kingdom. The peace had been bought at the cost of blood. But now, a new, far deadlier conflict was at hand. The next morning, Adam left with the bulk of the royal guard, heading north to reinforce the failing Vale. Alexander stayed behind, taking command of the castle and the remaining defense forces. Their farewell was brief, intense, and fraught with the knowledge that this battle was existential. "Come back to me, Alpha," she commanded, pulling his head down and kissing him with fierce possessiveness. "I will return to my queen," he promised, his eyes burning with the amber light of the Alpha he was, the man he had become because of her. Alone, Alexander set about fortifying the castle. She worked tirelessly, but the mystery of her mother continued to haunt her. She realized there was one place she hadn't looked, one person she hadn't interrogated, the traitor, Lazarus, who still languished in the deepest dungeon, stripped of his power, awaiting judgment. Alexander descended into the darkness of the dungeons alone. Lazarus was gaunt, his eyes hollowed by fear and the loss of his alpha status. He sneered, his voice weak. "The queen honors me with a visit." "I'm not here for an honor, Beta," Alexander said, keeping a cold distance. "I'm here for the truth. You knew the prophecy was a lie. Where did the king get the fake scroll? And what is my mother's real role?" Lazarus, realizing his last chance for relevance, spoke. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The king didn't find the scroll. He was given it by the person who designed this entire masquerade." Alexander felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Who?" Lazarus smiled, a venomous, terrible twist of his lips. "The king was visited by a seer years ago, not from Arkenmore, but from the Shadow Vale's outer reaches. The seer who delivered the fake prophecy was none other than Alara Morgan." Alexander gasped, staggering back.
Her mother, the cook, the pauper. She wasn't a pauper, Queen, Lazarus hissed, triumphant. She was a powerful shadow seer, one of the last guardians of the veil. She used the fake prophecy to force the Alpha King to bring her hidden daughter, the born Alpha, into the castle, right where she needed to be, to close the veil before the Aetherians rose. She never abandoned you, Alexander. She deployed you. The truth hit Alexander with the force of her own innate power. Her mother hadn't been a victim. She had been the master strategist. The entire conflict, the betrayal, the capture, it was all a meticulously crafted trap set by her own mother to ensure Alexander would rise as an equal alpha, bond with Adam, and be ready to face the ancient darkness. Alexander left the dungeon, the truth a weight of terrifying, beautiful responsibility. She was not just a queen, she was the linchpin of a massive supernatural defense plan orchestrated by her mother. The final battle was upon them, and she needed to be ready. The castle descended into a tense operational silence after Adam's departure. Alexander, however, was galvanized by the truth of her lineage. She summoned her newly formed royal kitchen corps and the remaining loyal guards. They fortified the inner castle, turning the halls and courtyards into strategic choke points, ready for the retreat of the Northern Guard. 3 days later, the news was catastrophic. Adam's forces were retreating, bloodied and exhausted. The Aetherians were not mere shadows. They were powerful, magical entities capable of corrupting the minds of men and wolves alike. Adam himself was wounded and fighting a losing battle. The shadow veil was breached. Alexander knew she couldn't wait. She gathered the loyal forces and addressed them in the throne room, her voice ringing with the absolute authority of a born alpha. "The king is fighting for his life. Now we fight for our home," she declared, wearing her dark, practical battle leathers instead of royal silks. "We are the last line of defense. The Aetherians feed on fear and chaos. We will give them neither. We fight with courage, unity, and the unbreakable will of Arkenmore." She led the charge herself, riding out from the gates with the core defenders. A black woman, a former cook, leading a battered army into the night. Her alpha power was fully unlocked now, a palpable, shimmering energy that commanded loyalty and respect. They met Adam and his shattered guard 2 miles from the castle. The scene was devastating. Men lying wounded, the air filled with the stench of magic and fear, and the Aetherians, figures of undulating shadow and cold fire, advancing slowly, inexorably. Adam, his face grim and covered in soot and blood, looked relieved, but exhausted to see her. "Alexander, no!" Adam gasped, trying to stop her. "They are too strong. They corrupt the mind." "They feed on fear," Alexander countered, dismounting instantly. "We give them power. Together."
She took his hand. Instantly, the raw, untapped power that coursed through her met the structured, immense power of the Alpha King. The connection was electric, blinding. The bond between the twin alphas, the true meaning of the prophecy, was finally complete. Their combined power exploded outward, a protective, golden force field that pushed the Aetherians back. Alexandra looked at Adam, her brown eyes blazing with amber alpha fire. "I don't want to be your bride, Adam. I want to be your equal. Now let's show them what 2 alphas can do." They faced the darkness side by side, 2 formidable forces. Adam led the physical battle, his strength renewed by their merged power. Alexandra focused her energy, channeling the innate magical strength of the Shadowseer lineage passed down from her mother. She didn't fight with a sword, she fought with will. She targeted the Shadow Veil breaches, sealing them with raw, concentrated bursts of her power, drawing on the very earth and spices that had once masked her identity. Adam protected her flank, ripping through the Aetherians that tried to break their concentration. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, primal contest of light and shadow. Finally, Alexandra poured every last reserve of her energy into the largest breach, screaming as the power tore through her, forcing the Shadow Veil to slam shut with a thunderous, magical clap. The Aetherians shrieked as they were instantly annihilated or banished back to their own realm. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute,
and profoundly peaceful. The kingdom was saved. Alexandra collapsed, caught instantly in Adam's massive protecting arms. Alexandra woke 3 days later in the king's own royal chamber, her energy restored. She was no longer bruised or chained. She was sovereign. Adam was sitting by her bedside, his face etched with exhaustion, but alight with love and respect. The veil is closed. The Ethereans are gone. Alexandra, you saved us all. You saved the kingdom, and you saved me from being the monster I feared I would become.
Alexander smiled, pulling his hand to her lips. We saved us, Adam, together. Weeks later, the people of Arkenmore, the nobility, the guards, and most importantly, the common people who had rallied behind the king, gathered in the throne room, not for a forced wedding, but for a coronation. Alexander stood before the throne of Arkenmore. She didn't wear a gown, but battle leathers, softened and embroidered with gold thread. Adam placed the heavy, silver circlet on her head, a crown forged to be an exact match to his own. I present to you, Arkenmore, Adam declared, his voice ringing with pride, your Alpha Queen, Alexander Morgan, the born Alpha, are equal in life and power. The crowd roared, a sound not of fear, but of genuine, heartfelt jubilation. Alexander stepped forward and addressed her people, her voice strong and clear. I may have once yelled, I will never be your bride to the Alpha King, but today I stand here not as a bride, but as your queen. We will rule this kingdom together, Alpha to Alpha, with justice, fairness, and the promise that the cook's daughter will always have a voice. The prophecy was fulfilled. The reluctant queen, through her rebellion, had brought not blood, but a new era of peace and equality. Adam and Alexander stood side by side, the twin alphas, king and queen, equal in every way, ready to face their new future. And every full moon, their howls echoed together, equal, wild, and free across the mountains of Arkenmore. The real war was over. The reign of the twin alphas had begun.